Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been caught lying and even involved in corruption connected to his foundations. The investigation has finally revealed why Viktor Orban is so desperate to keep the ability to buy Russian oil for himself and why he chose the strategy of discrediting Kiev and Brussels. Viktor Orban himself has been assuring Hungarians for years that buying cheap Russian oil and gas allows him to significantly, very significantly lower fuel and utility prices for citizens. But suddenly it turned out that in neighboring Czechia, which buys more expensive non-Russian oil, prices are 18% lower than in Hungary, which buys much cheaper Russian oil. How did this happen? And the answer to this question was just revealed in today's investigation. Viktor Orban insists that he is saving huge amounts of money from Hungary's budget by buying specifically Russian energy resources. But it turned out that the country allocates money based on average European prices. So where does the difference go? I mean the money that was supposedly saved. And now an investigation has shown that all this money quietly ends up in the country's largest oil company, which transfers the profits to special funds directly connected to Viktor Orban. So it turns out that Hungary seems to be getting cheap Russian oil, but for some reason, fuel prices in this country are 18% higher than in neighboring Czechia, which doesn't buy such cheap oil. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave any comment below. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There, we post breaking news as it comes in. So everyone is used to saying that Viktor Orban simply serves the interests of the Kremlin in Europe, but they completely forget that there is also a financial aspect and Viktor Orban's personal interest. As of today, Hungary is buying Russian oil specifically, despite the availability of alternative supply sources. Viktor Orban's authorities insist that they have no other choice, even though neighboring Croatia has been saying for 4 years, listen, we have an oil pipeline from the Adriatic Sea directly to Hungary. We can supply 100% of the oil this country needs. But Viktor Orban has always said that the Croatian pipeline is bad, that the prices are high, that the Croatians are unreliable, that they want to profit off the Hungarians and so on. And he kept buying Russian oil, assuring Hungarians that cheap oil from Russia allows him to set the lowest fuel prices in Europe in Hungary. And then suddenly, the Center for the Study of Democracy of the European Institute of Public Policy presented a report today that shocked everyone. The analysis showed that domestic fuel prices in Hungary in 2025 were on average 18% higher than in neighboring Czechia. Although Budapest still buys cheaper Russian oil and Prague buys more expensive non-Russian alternatives, logic would suggest that if Czechia buys more expensive oil, then fuel prices there should be higher. And Viktor Orban, who buys cheap Russian oil, should have provided Hungarians with super cheap fuel, but for some reason it turned out to be the opposite. The study disproves Istence's claim. It's about the fact that continuing to purchase Russian oil, despite the overall European efforts to gradually phase out Russian fossil fuels, makes fuel cheaper for Hungarians. In reality, it turned out that they bought cheap oil and sold expensive fuel. But where does the difference go? The business model is simply to buy cheap oil and sell the fuel at a much higher price, making a profit from the difference. And as the research showed, the savings mostly go to the Hungarian oil giant, whose operating profit has grown by 30% since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So all the super profits stay with the Hungarian oil giant. But Hungarian consumers never got to feel the full benefit of buying cheap Russian oil, but that's just the beginning. As it turned out, the company doesn't just refine oil into fuel, it also simply resells raw Russian oil at a higher price but under a different brand. So Hungary has simply become a gateway for Russian oil into Europe? But that's not all. And here I'll quote from a report by the Center for the Study of Democracy. The dependence on discounted Russian oil never reached the consumers. Instead, the profit from reselling cheap oil goes into the pocket of the monopoly supplier, supposedly as excess profit, which indirectly finances the state capture networks created by Viktor Orban. What does this mean? The fact is that the center tracked the money flows and concluded that there are several funds in Hungary where the company supposedly channels its profits, and as it turned out, all these funds are directly connected to Viktor Orban. To put it even more simply, the money goes to Orban and his organizations through a series of schemes, and here I'll just give a timeline to show that Orban is simply interested in money here. After Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine almost 4 years ago, members of the European Union took steps to end their dependence on Russian oil. In 2022, the European Union provided Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, that is, 3 Central European countries that are especially dependent on Russia for energy supplies, an exception to this rule, and called on them to reduce their dependence as soon as possible. Since then, out of this trio, only the Czech Republic has completely stopped purchasing Russian oil, but Hungary and Slovakia have taken advantage of the European Union's sanctions exemption to increase their dependence. Now, at the moment, in the Czech Republic, which is the only one that has given up Russian oil, gasoline is 18% cheaper than in Hungary. The report states that last year, Russia accounted for more than 92% of Hungary's crude oil imports, compared to 61% before the invasion. When the United States announced sanctions against 2 Russian oil giants in October, Viktor Orban quickly went to the White House to ask for a 1-year exemption from the sanctions. It became clear that Orban was willing to do whatever it took just to keep access to that Russian oil. And here Orban managed to deceive Donald Trump. Trump granted Orban's request, citing the fact that Hungary has no access to the sea. So, where else could it go except to pump oil through the Druzhba pipeline? But Trump simply didn't know that Croatia has access to the sea and that the pipeline runs through all of Croatia from the Adriatic Sea all the way to Hungary. And so, the Center for the Study of Democracy concludes that Hungary's continued purchase of Russian oil is a political choice, not a commercial or logistical necessity. Next is a quote from the report. Despite having full access to alternative supply routes, Hungary has deepened its dependence on Russian oil, turning a temporary exemption from European Union sanctions into a permanent loophole in the sanctions regime. And here's another argument in favor of the idea that Viktor Orban is simply making personal profit from Russian oil. Hungary receives Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline, which passes through Ukraine, but Hungary is also directly connected to the Adria pipeline, which goes through Croatia and, I emphasize, pumps non-Russian oil from the Adriatic coast. Researchers have proven that the Adria pipeline has enough capacity to meet the demand in Hungary and Slovakia. And they emphasize that the transit fee for it is 1.7 times lower than for the Druzhba pipeline, which passes through an active combat zone in Ukraine, almost twice as cheap. But Orban is not interested in any of these arguments, and now we understand why. And here is the result, followed by a quote from the report. Despite the fact that the company MOL was buying Russian oil at a significant discount, researchers noted that the company still sold its products at prices similar to those on other regional markets, which led to a sharp increase in its profits. The company's operating profit increased by 30% compared to the pre-crisis level. While 3 funds linked to Prime Minister Viktor Orban control 31% of MOL's shares, this allows excess profits to flow into some of the most influential Hungarian state capture networks. But unfortunately, Viktor Orban now has a patron in the form of Donald Trump. And today, at a joint press conference in Budapest, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the sanctions exemption was granted mainly because of the relationship between Orban and Trump. Rubio announced a golden era of relations between the two countries and told Orban that Hungary's success serves the national interests of the United States, especially as long as Orban remains Prime Minister. Researchers from the Center for the Study of Democracy still recommended that the European Commission adopt a bill as soon as possible to ban the import of Russian crude oil to Hungary and Slovakia. Since there is no reason to maintain an exception for these two countries, why is that? Because the Czech Republic has long shown that it's possible to do without Russian oil and still keep prices low. But in the case of Viktor Orban, as you understand, the issue is not about consumer prices at all. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. If you found this episode useful and interesting, you can support the work of this YouTube channel financially with your donation or paid subscription. Links and payment details are in the video description. Choose the platform and format that works best for you. I will be grateful for any support from you. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.